Peace be upon you and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan. This is the podcast that's essential listening for those looking to recapture what it means to be human in the modern age. Way Stations is about celebrating the pursuit of living life as a journey, treading softly upon the earth, and offering other wayfarers, i.e. yourself who are listening, a place of respite from the rigors of the road. Today, my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad, and I are going to explore the theme of solitude versus loneliness. Now, we know in many parts of the world, there is a loneliness epidemic, which seems to be creating adverse social and health problems. We'll look at maybe, what's happening there. And we'll look at how is loneliness different from solitude, and what, if any, are the benefits of solitude as well. And at a practical level, what does that mean? So there's quite a lot to get through to, but let me first of all just welcome Dr. Walead. So Dr. Walead, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rehan. Look forward to this session with you, and a very interesting topic. And I think we both have a lot to say about it, and I'm looking forward to hear what you come up with also.
Great. So let's get started on this topic. Now, I remember one book I looked at was actually called, and we're talking about loneliness, and it was actually called Loneliness, and it was written by University of Chicago psychologist John Cacioppo. And he looked at kind of 30 years of data on this topic. And what he found was that where there is a lack of social connections, it's actually just as deadly as certain diseases. It causes psychological harm, and it causes, many, many other issues. And kind of the base they were looking at was about 30,000 people. So it was a reasonably large kind of study. And they found that those people who had fewer social ties were 2 to 3 times more likely to actually suffer from depression, a major depression that is, compared to people who had strong ties. And so I guess, when we enjoy strong social support around us, we can actually accomplish, some significant feats as well, whether it's, recovering and so on. So for example, in one study that they quoted, they said that anyone who receives emotional support during the 6 months after a heart attack, that individual was 3 times more likely to survive. Okay. And the same kind of type of findings in terms of data and studies have also been found for employees in organizations. So one particular study I remember looking at, they found that during the course of the workday, when you have a positive interaction with a fellow colleague, it actually returns the cardiovascular system back to resting levels, something that's called work recovery. Okay, so actually when you have, positive interactions with people, then your cardiovascular system actually goes back to resting levels. And each kind of positive connection also lowers cortisol, which obviously is the hormone that's generated when you're stressed, right? So actually, all of these little interactions that we're having with other people, whether it's in the work environment or whether it's at home, but where there's a social, support structure around you, starts to, work in the individual's favor and offset this issue of loneliness. But yeah, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this subject as well, Dr. Walead.
Well, I think that's interesting. I think there are many other studies too that reach similar results. And when I think about loneliness or the idea of feeling alone, and we'll get to this, I think, later in the podcast, it's not the same exact thing as being in solitude or not necessarily interacting with other people. It's an emotional response. It's a feeling that you have rather than it being a state, a physical state, but rather an emotional response to whatever physical state that you may have. And so the idea of feeling lonely then doesn't just apply if you're physically alone. I think it also applies, you could be amongst multitudes and still feel lonely because something is missing. And I think that's kind of the deeper rooted cause. And as you mentioned, people at work, when they have a positive interaction with somebody, that lifts their state and lowers their stress level. And I would probably say or assume that if they had a negative interaction, it would do the opposite. And, if you have, if we think about ourselves and we go through a day where we have maybe what seemed like trivial negative interactions. You set out, you drive your car to work, and then you have some sort of, altercation with another motorist, or not necessarily altercation, but, something that was tense. And then you get to your car park, and then maybe you don't find the parking spot that you hoped for, and you have to go around a few times. Already your morning has set off to a particular tone, and you may feel more isolated from everything around you, and so forth. So I think that's kind of more of the root cause we have to look at. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to our lifestyles today, modern lifestyle. We no longer really live in communal villages where we have extended family surrounding us, and you can walk over to an uncle or to an aunt or a cousin and so forth, and you don't have multi-generational households so much anymore, at least in most Western countries. And I think, and obviously, we value privacy very much so in our societies, and we value individuality and the ability to kind of set the tone for our life and how we go about doing it, and so forth. But I think we have to think about at what cost. Certainly, if we were to advocate more of a communal lifestyle, there would be some sacrifices associated with that, right? Not every individual then is going to do the exact thing that they have their heart set upon as an individual, but when you have to take other people into consideration, and for many Muslim households, for example, I think especially people our generation, we're called the sandwich generation, where we have still have children that we're maybe looking after, or they're getting into adulthood or starting their adulthood, and at the same time we have elderly parents. And for us to function as individuals in this particular, state of our life, we would really adversely affect both of those generations. So the parents' generation, and also our children. So by default, we may have to start thinking more communally, unless less as an individual. But I'm wondering if we were to apply that and think about that in other situations in our life. The Arabs and Muslims in general, they have this proverb that goes something like "Al-Jar qabla dar," the neighbor before the house. So, in other words, consider who you're going to be keeping companionship with as a neighbor before you think about what the house looks like and what neighborhoods it's in, and how many rooms it has, and what's the square footage or square meter of the house. And these are the things that people think about primarily. But do we actually consider, are these people that are going to be living around us, are we going to be able to give them their rights, for example, and, live as a community, or are we going to live as individuals just sharing space? And if you look at in your house, if you have a spouse, for example, and you have that type of scheme, where you don't really have true companionship, sohbah, intimacy, and you're just people sharing space, it would render people miserable most of the time, because that's not what they're looking for at least in their very own home. But I think we can extend that idea even beyond just the space of your house and into the neighborhood, the community, and so forth. So I think it's a deep-rooted issue. It's not a simple one to address. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective a little bit more about some of the modern things that we do. Maybe a lot of people, their time gets caught up with social media and technology, and sometimes we think that's kind of a replacement or in lieu of having these kind of true friendships. And I was wondering, your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I know for sure. And I think just one thing that maybe is worth exploring is whether also, because you said that people sometimes have a multitude of individuals around them, but they still feel lonely. So were you thinking about life in a big city, for example? And is that something that you've seen that's kind of more of a problem compared to, say, in a more rural community?
Maybe, but I don't think it's necessarily indicative or endemic of a big city per se. I think it's possible to happen just by virtue that there are so many more people there that you obviously don't have that attachment with. And I think what kind of exacerbates the situation is you see all of these people around you seemingly having these sort of connections, and you walk into a cafe, and then you see a group of friends there, and you're kind of like, feel like you're the odd man out, and don't have the same sort of connection. But I think a similar thing could happen in a small town, or a small city, or a small village, because the whole idea is, let's call it shared purpose, shared values, uh, a feeling of that others care about you and you care about them. Just being in their presence kind of lifts your spirits. Some of the themes that we touch upon when we talk about sohbah, right? And interestingly enough, this is a theme that you find many Muslim scholars talk about often, the idea of sohbah, having like this kind of true camaraderie and friendship with someone else. And, the Arabs have numerous names for even levels of companionship, from going from just someone you just met to an acquaintance to a friend to a closer confidant. The Quranic language uses this phrase called waliyun hamim, right? And it says that one of the keys to get to this very close friendship is not to repel something that was done negatively with another negative thing. So the Quran tells us to do idfa billati hiya ahsan. Repel with something that is better. فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. So then you'll find that the one where there was enmity between you. And the interesting thing here in this particular verse, it doesn't say they're your enemy. It says there is enmity between you. In other words, a temporary state. It need not be permanent. It need not be the default in your relationship, even with that particular person. But if you repel that with something better, right, with a kind word, with tolerance, with compassion, and so forth, then you will find they could be your closest confidant. Because I think what happens there is, as we just mentioned earlier, you feel there's not a lot of shared things between you when you have an argument or you have, an adversarial relationship with somebody. They're doing this and I'm doing that, and, we don't have common ground. But if you extend the olive branch, so to speak, and say, look, we do have common ground. I am willing to come towards your way a little bit and share your ground wherever you're at. I'm willing to come where you're at, which is basically what happens if you if you treat them with kindness and fairness, compassion, and so forth. Then they get the feeling like, oh wait, there is a possibility that we do have commonalities and we could work towards that, and so forth. So I think one of the things that we suffer from as societies in general is we sometimes live under the illusion that people out there who are naturally or by default are going to be our adversaries. And you see this in the political climate, obviously, a lot of polarization. And even within religious communities, sometimes you find people saying, like, well, they have a different way of seeing the religion, a different way of practicing. And then you automatically make these assumptions when you come across these sorts of people, and you think, I can never be friends with them or have any sort of meaningful relationship.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that, we've certainly, I'm sure you've encountered this, and I've certainly experienced it to some, lesser level, is that when you are with people, certain people, they are present. And by them being present, you feel present in their presence, right? Whereas sometimes you go to like a coffee shop or something and you see a group of friends sitting down talking, and they're actually all on their smartphones, right? And no one's actually talking to each other. And I think there was a study done on this, and they said that when, if you have a fractured conversation with someone, right? So they're on the phone, you're on the phone, and you talk. And then later on, like a week later, someone asks you, what did you actually say? What did you, it's very difficult to recall. But actually, if you had a conversation where you were present, no devices, but you actually was listening to each other, then it's far easier to recall that later on. So I think one of the things that about presence, and this is what we find with certainly the best teachers, is that they're present, they give you your time, they give their time to you, and you feel that when you're with them, that you are the most important person at that moment, right? So I don't know if if you want to add anything there or not.
Well, that's actually a very prophetic quality. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made everyone feel like they're the most important person in the room. And some of the Sahaba actually said that and commented on that. And, one of them sought to actually test that theory, and he started asking, who's better, me or this person? And then the Prophet ﷺ had to be truthful. He said the other person and the other person. He kept asking those questions, but the idea behind it is he gave his undivided attention to people and made them feel important and made them feel like whatever they had to say or whatever issue they were discussing is something that's also of importance to him. I get the feeling some people might have a reaction to that and say, well, that doesn't really, you're saying like fake it till you make it. What if it's not important to you? But the thing is, it's not the idea that the issue is important to you. It's the idea that that person's important to you.
Mm.
So that means that anything that they have, even if it may be in of itself not that big an issue or trivial issue, but it is becomes of importance because that person is important. And then you might say, well, that person's not really that important to me. And then I would say, well, that's maybe something, a flaw perhaps you have to address in yourself rather than the other person, because generally speaking, we should attach importance to everybody. Um, and I think that's part of the idea of generosity. It's not just generosity with wealth, but generosity with time, with sharing, with listening, uh, that sort of thing. You know, how many of us are willing to give up our listening capacity, right? Because I think that's probably a finite resource too. You could only kind of, if we can get into the whole introvert extrovert thing, but not necessarily that. But some people will be drained and have to kind of recover from a session with someone who's doing that, and other people may be charged, have a recharge by being with certain people. But if you're willing to give up some of that for the sake of the other person, I think that's a beautiful quality and attribute that people maybe think about cultivating within themselves.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, for sure, for sure. And as you were talking, just one piece of research came to mind, which was done. It was a global piece of work, and it was looking at the people, according to the study, who were the happiest people. So, why were the happiest people in the world the happiest, like the top 10%? Was it because they lived in, blue zones? Were they wealthy? Were they physically fit? Actually, it was one characteristic that really distinguished them, which was their social relationships, right? And that's what made the happiest 10% the happiest. It was the fact that they actually had the best social relationships around them, whatever that might be. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's definitely a lot of academic and scientific work around this to corroborate that. So we've been speaking a little bit so far about loneliness and you know looking at some of the issues it can generate, some of the challenges. But there is another word that obviously we want to talk about today, which was solitude. And maybe we can start to kind of look a little bit into the subject of solitude, because again, it's not loneliness, but sometimes people think it is. If you're going off to be in a solitary condition, then actually you're going to be lonely. Well, maybe not. And maybe, I think, maybe you can help us think through is there a sacred side to solitude? And maybe just talk a little bit about companionship also in when it comes to solitude as well.
Well, the old adage that says you come into this world alone and you leave this world alone, uh, and otherwise in solitude, which is true. And I think looking at the prophetic teachings, we see, this idea of, let's say, detachment, sometimes referred to as zuhud, or sufficing oneself with what's necessary in terms of improvements and attachments and material things and things like that. And the ability to kind of, let's meditate and be silent with yourself. And those are seen as noble things to do, noble qualities, noble attributes, and noble traits. And if we look at the career of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, we find that he spent much more time alone early on than he did later on. So the origin story, so to speak, of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, which is like the second hadith in the Bukhari collection, and referred to as the hadith of the beginning of Revelation, is that he spent many nights and days in Ghar Hira, in the mountain of Thawr, the cave of, in the mountain there that was some distance from his house that he could walk to. But he would stay there many days and nights at a time. He would then descend the mountain. His wife Khadijah would give him some provision, and then he'd go back up. And this was all pre-prophethood. This is before he had the encounter with Archangel Jibreel, or Gabriel alayhi salam. And she described, that Aisha is describing in the hadith, what he used to do up there. And it's called a tahannuth, which really means worship, but worship in solitude. In other words, dedicating oneself entirely to worship and not having anything else to think about. And you get the feeling from that even being in solitude in and of itself is kind of an act of worship on its own, even without doing anything else. And you find that he did that very early on. Whether he actually had the opportunity after prophethood and ascend the mountain again and do what he used to do before. We have no indication, at least I'm not aware of, that he actually did that again. And now he was had a responsibility, obviously. So he had to shoulder the responsibility of dawah and his mission and contending with people who would oppose him, and then eventually they'd make the emigration and hijrah to Al-Medina and so forth. So, but he was constantly amongst people at that time. But yet we are told or understand that he had a higher spiritual state then than he was when he was in solitude. So solitude is a type of, let's say, spiritual cleansing aid that kind of allows you to, in much the same way if we go on a special type of diet or like a water detox or pollen cleanse or something like that, then similarly, I think people use these bits of solitude, or they can be used, these bits of solitude. And we find that not only in the Muslim tradition, we find it in other traditions also. And you find it in Christianity, Catholicism, Buddhism, the idea of, having some solitude for worship and to gather with one's thoughts and things like this. So I think that could be a very positive thing if people do it in the right way. But one of the things that we notice in the time that we live in is, practically speaking, most people are already in that state. Most people today, I think, even if let's say you work from home, or if you work in an office, when you're not in a meeting, you're by yourself, and usually the meetings are reserved for people who are managers, but people who are kind of doing the work, I think they find a lot of solitude. Then it's not very positive for them. And it only adds to that when they get home, maybe to an empty apartment or empty house, or they feel estranged from the family members in their house, and then they retreat to their own room, and everybody's in their own room, and they're already dealing with the solitude. So I think it works, but it has to work in a particular way. And maybe the remedy that we are facing now is not so much the idea of physical solitude, but the type of result we're looking for, which is to have a kind of detachment from those things that are fleeting and those things that are only temporarily give us an uplift. Because if we continue to seek those things, we're always going to be, have a lack of satiation. We're always going to feel we need the next thing and the more and so forth. But if you get that spiritual uplift by using your time in solitude in a manner that's going to uplift you, then even your relationships will become more positive. Then you can have this idea that we talked about earlier, that we alluded to, true sohbah, true companionship with others. So just like you were mentioning earlier, that you come into the presence of people, they're present with you and they raise you. The idea then of this solitude or uzla or khalwa in Arabic is so that you could be one of those people. So that you can become one of those people. You become one of those people that you enter into a room and people feel uplifted by your presence, right? And if we have enough people who are doing that, then you actually change this loneliness epidemic, and people feel that here are people who care about me, people who love me, people who just see me for myself. They don't want anything from me. They're not looking for any sort of personal benefit or interest, but companionship for the sake of companionship and mutual human uplifting. And I think that's kind of the thing that we're looking for.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So it's almost like you need solitude as part of the journey to prepare you to deal with people.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it. And
Yeah.
and I think one of the guidelines to keep in mind is, okay, I need to get away from these people because they're bad and I don't want to deal with them. That would
Yeah.
be, contrary to what you're trying to do. It should be the opposite. I need
Mm.
to address things within myself. And then when I go back to the people, then I'll be in a much better state to give them, rather than take, I'm looking to give, then I think it'll make a lot of positive results.
Yeah, and I guess one thing certainly as someone who's a writer and I know talking to other artists as well, often at the start of your career, and I've been writing now, writing novels for about 15, 16 years now, so it's a little bit of time. So I have a bit of practice under my belt. But I remember at the start when I started writing novels, I needed a lot of solitude in terms of quiet space, really to help me focus. But as I, you know, got a bit more uh, proficient with it, I actually needed less of that. I could then start writing pretty much anywhere, wherever I was. As long as I was alone with my thoughts, I could actually kind of block out the sound. But at the beginning, I couldn't do that. And, this kind of this notion of getting into a state, a particular hal, I think psychologist, I think it was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was a professor at Harvard. I think the book was, he called it flow state. He called it flow state. And, he observed artists like painters and others and writers, and he noticed that when they were really into creating their work and doing their work, whether it was on a canvas or writing something, it almost felt to him that something was flowing through them, i.e., they weren't necessarily doing it, but something was flowing through them. And these artists kept saying that I was carried on by the flow. I was carried on by the flow. And they were so absorbed in this state, in this hal, that they felt that something was flowing through them. So then, he then kind of went out and started looking at researching people in other areas, in different professions, across different countries, and across different cultures. And wherever he looked, these kind of experiences that people had, whether they were brain surgeons or whether they were athletes or whether they were teachers or whether they were whatever they were doing, these kind of experiences that people had of being in flow, they described as their career highlights. These were the times they could really, really enjoyed work. And even if I look back at my 30 years of working in the corporate sector, I could have been working on a financial model, but I was so into it that I was kind of flowing, and I could remember, oh, that really felt good. Although as a financial model, it's like boring compared to maybe doing something else. But it's not necessarily the task, but it's your kind of how you address it. And so I think his work really kind of shone a light on that. And I think again, from my experience and talking to other artists, what I found is that if you want to hit that kind of that gusher of flow, then there's a couple of things you need to do. Number one, you need to have a clearly defined goal, right? So I want to, do this painting. I want to run up this hill. I want to teach my child how to swim. Okay. Because when you have a clearly defined goal and you're not just sitting around doing nothing, but you have a clearly defined goal, then you're going to kind of resolve to pursue that. And that single tasking will really make you present, that I've got to do this one thing, and I'm not multitasking. I'm not trying to do too many things. Okay. Because getting into flow state requires all of your brain power. It requires all of your, cognitive abilities. So I think that's number one. You need to have clearly defined goal, single tasking, remove distraction. Okay. And certainly when I write novels, that's what I try and do. I think the second thing to get into flow state, to take advantage of that solitude, is also to do something that's meaningful, right? If it's not meaningful, you're just not going to do it. Right? So I really want to do this. I really want to invest in myself, because when you're trying to learn one of these soft skills, like concentration, like flow, like negotiation, what you're doing is that you are making an investment in your future self. You're saying that I value the person that I want to become. So I'm making this investment now, and maybe there's a payoff later. Just as people make financial investments, they make an investment now, and then they hope for a payoff later on. So I think with these kind of soft skills or these traits of character or these attitudes, what we're doing, we're making an investment in our future self. So we're saying we value who we want to become, because we know that we're not there, but we value that. So I think that's the second thing, that it's got to be meaningful. And then I think the third thing is that to really get into flow, or to get into that, to use solitude in a way that it is beneficial, I think you need to be doing something. And again, this is what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi said. You need to be doing something that is at the edge of your abilities. Because if it's too easy, right, you're on autopilot. If it's too difficult, you get anxiety. But if it's just on the edge of your ability, right, you just push yourself, and then you improve, you push yourself, you improve, you push yourself, you improve. So I certainly think that when we're looking at the topic of solitude, that if we are going into times of solitude, we need to be having a clearly defined goal. Why am I doing this? we need to be doing something that's meaningful, and maybe we need to be doing something that's at the kind of edge of our abilities as well. So I don't know if you've, Dr. Waleed, if you've got anything that you want to kind of add to that, because I was talking for quite a while there.
Well, that's very good. That's interesting. This idea of flow. I think looking at it deeper perspective, when people are in the state of flow, whether they're creative type, and sometimes runners talk about this too, right? They say runners high, and they're actually just running by themselves, but it's like they describe it as almost out of body experience, like they're witnessing what's going on. They're not the active doer or participant. And I think when that's the case, then it's like there's a third entity there or a second entity that's not you. And whether people realize it or not, I think that second entity is in a divine grace, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can empower people to, feel at one with what they're doing, and have a heightened level of awareness, whether they believe in kind of a heightened level of spiritualness or not, but they definitely feel it. And they feel like, wow, I'm capable of something I didn't think I was capable of, and now it's happening, and it's like it's effortless, and I'm watching it, and I think a lot of people have gone through that type of thing. And to me, that's indicative of sohbah at the highest level, or companionship at the highest level, when you're really having companionship with the sublimity of everything around you. So you stop seeing things as just merely ordinary, and then everything kind of comes out to you in with vibrancy and in color. And if like before flow you're dealing in black and white, then flow during flow it's 4K, high resolution, all of the colors, and you just see things so much more vividly. And that's a level of companionship, whether people realize it or not. I think that's how I see it. And many people who go into meditative states and with dhikr or in the solitude have similar feelings. That it's like I'm saying it, but it's like I'm not saying it, right? And even some of the great Sufi masters like Ibn Arabi, he would say, "Haqiqatu dhikri la dhikr," that the highest form of remembrance is not to remember. People think, well, that sounds counterintuitive. What does he mean by that? He means like you're no longer actively doing it yourself as if you're the one doing it. It's like you're not doing it, but it's being done for you. And that's the higher level, or maybe the highest level of awareness. So once someone is in such a state like that, then they could technically still be interacting with all these different sorts of people, but they have this kind of layer of protection and just of lack of a better word, of happiness, to the degree that other people won't affect them that much, because they have this solid kind of core of intimacy with something, with other than people, though they may not be able to articulate it. But that's actually, I think, what's happening. Of course, the great masters of spirituality and purification of soul, they have methods and means by which you get to that, and obviously it has to happen by divine grace. But actually, that's kind of the idea, that you get to be in flow, really, which is to be in dhikr, right? Is to be in remembrance of your heart, where you are at the same time so perfectly aware of what's happening all the time, and yet detached from your personal attribution to that particular thing. So it's like it's happening, you're doing it, but you're not really doing it. You're witnessing it. And that's why they use this word mushahada, right? That you're more of a witness than you are a doer. And then the verse in the Quran that kind of states that quite unequivocally. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. It's not you who threw the arrow, but it was God who threw the arrow when you threw the arrow.
Right.
So outwardly, you did throw the arrow, but inwardly, metaphysically, once you let go of, you pull back the string on the bow, and once you let your finger go, you no longer have control over that arrow. And it was just an illusion that you did from the beginning. So once it's on its course, even the archers, they say, once the arrow leaves your bow, then, it's all Allah after that, whether it hits a target, doesn't hit the target, where it goes, and so forth. And that's kind of a metaphor for life, right? It's about also letting go. And one of the things that people, I think, who are in flow or in this heightened state of awareness, is they have a letting go. They're like, okay, like I don't have this kind of being hung up or ambivalence or worry or anxiety about what the result is going to be, because they're so into the moment. And that's the whole idea. not to worry about the past, not to worry about the future, but be in your moment. And that's actually a restatement of the state of dhikr, to be in the moment and not to be in the past and not to be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's almost like this state of dhikr is almost like a gateway to that state in
Right,
some
right.
ways. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's interesting when you look at it from a sports science perspective, you look at athletes before they're going to run the 100 meters, before they're about to go out and play on center court. Many of these athletes go through certain rituals. Right. They'll always have certain rituals. They'll put the watch on this hand in this way, and then they'll put these on and they'll breathe in this way, or they'll jump on one foot. There's certain
Yeah,
rituals they're going through,
yeah,
right? And it's almost like when you watch them, you're thinking they're trying to get into a place that they know where they can perform in a peak state, right?
right. Yeah, yeah,
And I guess that when you look at, dhikr in some to some extent, it might maybe it's there to facilitate that for us, right? Like constant awareness, right? Um, and I think one of the things that, again, looking from a sports science perspective, what the research shows is that when people get into that kind of heightened state, call it flow, call it peak performance, whatever you want to call it. When you get into that heightened state, interestingly, in the brain, there are sort of six really powerful neurochemicals come online, right? So these are norepinephrine, dopamine, endorphins, serotonin, anandamide, and oxytocin. So these
mm,
six neurochemicals, which are really the pleasure-producing chemicals in the brain, they all come online. They all activate, right? So you feel
mm,
great. You feel
yep,
great, right?
yep,
So unfortunately today, there's a lot of people who are taking antidepressants, and of course, in some cases, there's very genuine uh, um, clinical kind of problems, and for sure. But maybe for other people, actually, rather than taking that medication, it might be that if they find something that they can really get into, those
mm,
neurochemicals are going to just naturally start to
right.
produce themselves. And of course, I say there will always be some people who for sure, that are in the more critical state, and they take those medications. But for a lot of people, really, it could be finding that thing. And interestingly, as you say, dhikr is one kind of possible gateway for us as well.
Yeah, when you mentioned center court, I had the image of Rafael Nadal walking through the tunnel, and then how he does his jumping up and down right before he walks into it. And no, it's funny, but I think that's like you said, that's what he's doing. He's doing a reset. He's actually,
Yeah.
it's kind of taking myself out of the less heightened state of awareness that was before the tunnel, and now I'm walking onto center court, and now I'm ready to put myself in the more heightened state of awareness. And basically, very similarly, when you hold a sibha or when you mention invocations, particular divine invocations, that's what you're doing. Even the prayer, right? Why do we have physical movement associated with aspects of the prayer? We can just say, why can't you just pray silently sitting down? Which you can do, of course. But the ritual prayer, we raise our hands back and we say, Allahu Akbar, and then we put our hands back down going into center court. Yeah, obviously with the big difference, but we're going into a different place, and we're reminding ourselves that we're going into that different state. So certainly, even the correspondence of the physical movements with let's say the metaphysical movements plays a significant role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, okay. Right. So Dr. Reed, I think I'm kind of mindful of the time. Actually, we're kind of like, running down the time really fast on this podcast. I think we're coming to an end now and of this particular show. And we've had quite a very broad discussion, which started off by looking at loneliness and identifying some of the challenges for a lot of people living in a kind of a, in the modern world today. We kind of looked at solitude as well and why that's different, and the importance of companionship, sohbah, having strong social connections, and also then this topic of things like dhikr and just getting into a particular state so that you can maybe perform better at whatever you're trying to do. So, as we kind of come to a close, one thing I'd just like to ask you, maybe if you can share something that you've been reading recently that might be of interest to the listeners as well.
I read a book recently called 4,000 Weeks, by Oliver Berkman. People are like, what's 4,000 weeks? What does that mean? So he's basically says if you live 80 or so years, that's how many weeks you're going to live. So, looking at average lifespans around the world, this may be something around 80 plus or minus. And he says, with such, he makes kind of what he deems to be a bold assertion, which it is, if you think about it, that we only have so much time. There's a finite number of hours and weeks and days that we're going to live. And so then we should be quite discerning about how we spend those hours and those days and those weeks. And actually, I think the interesting thing is generally when people look at time, they think about productivity and they say, okay, I'm using my time wisely if I'm being productive, right? And then I think productivity is one of those words that it's a plastic word that the German linguist, famous German linguist, talk about plastic words. They can kind of be manipulated to mean anything like development and freedom and liberation. But productivity, producing what exactly? Are producing material things, or are we actually doing things? Spending time to actively make yourself a better person. I think that's highly productive, and it may be as simple as taking a walk by a stream or in the forest, or making a phone call, asking about people, having a coffee with someone. But in practical terms today, people don't think that's that productive. And he says this is what really stresses out our time, because we always feel this pressure to be productive and do these sorts of things. But I mean, if you look to, let's say, pre-modern lifestyles, people may say, why would we do that? They weren't that productive. Maybe not productive in the sense that we have, but it seems like many of them were much happier people than we are today, even though we have all of the things that should make life much easier and remove the stress, but they seem to induce stress rather than bring about stress. So I thought he had an interesting perspective, and he mentioned some tips and tools to how to kind of let things go and not so worry so much about productivity and worry more about, here are the finite hours of my life. Let me make the best of them and the things that make me happy. And I think that's not
Mhm.
a bad sentiment at all.
Yeah, and I guess one thing in that topic around productivity is that there seems to be a focus on quantity, right? And measurement and instrumentation and how many did you do? Whether it's looking at things like more and more people wearing, sports watches and counting their steps and their push-ups and whatever else it is, or whether it's at work and how many emails did you send today, right? It's that kind of thing. So there's a focus
Mhm.
on quantity, but there's not necessarily a focus on quality. And
Mhm.
and I think, quality definitely generally wins out, right? Quality will always win out because people will remember a quality piece of work that you delivered. Yeah.
Mm.
Whereas they
Mm.
won't necessarily remember a quantity. And even if you look at back in the old Soviet days, you see this Soviet sort of propagandists at the time, they'd always like this particular worker has, dug this much tons of iron by themselves. It was all around productivity, and maybe we can do that on a different show to talk about quantity versus quality as a metric and what determines that. So no, that's great. I think a couple of books I would recommend. I think maybe one non-fiction and two fiction. Let me start with the non-fiction one. So the non-fiction one I'd like to recommend to people, and one I reread actually many times, is Signs on the Horizon by Harun Sujik. And it's one of those books that first time I finished it, I was on a flight and I got to the end of the book and I went back to the start and I reread it again because it was just so compelling, right?
Mm.
And what Harun Sujik does is that he really looking back over the last sort of 50 or so years since he became Muslim, he kind of traces his journeys of meeting with sages and with saints from the Muslim world
Mm.
in North Africa, in Arabia, in the Far East, etc. And it's just really one of those books where you're you suddenly you're exposed to this world and these people that are around you, and you just haven't noticed that they were there,
Mm.
but they were just
Hmm.
lights like shining, and you just didn't notice them, right? And then suddenly, and he was someone who kind of went out looking for these people, and him and his kind of co-collaborator to some extent, Peter Sanders on the photography side. I think they both went out looking for these people, and very fortunate to have found many of them. And the audiobook for Signs on the Horizon is also out now by Harun Sujik, and he reads it himself, and it's very nice listening to his kind of dulcet tones as he reads the book. So that's one book I would recommend to people, which is nonfiction, but it's definitely very uplifting listening to those stories. The second book I'm just kind of finishing a moment, is The Romance of the Three Kingdoms by Lu Ganzhong. And this is basically a Chinese novel written many hundred years ago. And it's basically about the collapse of the Han Empire. So the Han Empire was an empire that ruled over China for several hundred years. And then it goes through this collapse, and we're talking about, I think, in the early hundreds or 200 or something AD. And the story, essentially, it's about warlords and schemers and heroes and villains who, as the Han dynasty collapses, they all try and essentially grab power, and these kind of three kingdoms emerge. So really, it's really interesting. Very a book. And yeah, it's one of those ones. It's a bit long. So maybe, like 1,800 pages. So it's not necessarily for everyone, but it's certainly worth a read if you're interested into the classics. And the other book I'd recommend, which is a fiction, which is much shorter, is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature many years ago. And The Remains of the Day, it also won the Booker Prize. It's set in the 1950s in England, and it follows the life of a butler called Stevens. And he's an aging butler who's been serving a hall called Darlington Hall. And he served the old Lord of Darlington Hall, Lord Darlington. But then after Lord Darlington passed away, he's now serving an American who's actually bought Darlington Hall. Now, what I particularly liked about the book, and it's kind of framed in a historical setting, but it really explores the subject of dignity. And throughout the book, Stevens, the butler, is trying to explore, what does it mean to be a dignified person? Now, words like dignity and decorum, for example, you don't hear them very often in modern parlance at all, really. And so this book really kind of got me thinking about, when we encounter people, or when we meet others, are we emitting a dignified uh, composure? Are we in a state of decorum or not? And I guess you just see less and less of that in society these days. And so that's an interesting book, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, who's a Japanese British writer. So yeah, before I conclude, Dr. Waleed, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, we didn't really discuss kind of state of the situation and some of the things that people tend to do, but I think on a practical level, uh, I would recommend to people that they just focus, leave time for themselves. That's important, and even to try to bookend your days with just a moment of reflection, even if it's for a few moments, a few minutes, kind of to reset. We talked this idea about reset, even athletes doing it, and to have a reset at the beginning of the day, reset at the end of the day, and try to be more present in the moment. Then you'll much less likely feel lonely, though you may be alone. And even when you're amongst people, you recognize that even if the people are there, they're not there. I'm never quite alone. We are all creatures of this earth, and we believe that we're placed here by God, and we're here for a reason. And so I think we should keep that in mind, and constantly remind ourselves of that, and then hopefully even have good company, people that do uplift us, and endeavor to be such people also. Because I think if you're willing to give, in that way, then you find others who will be willing to give to you as well. So
Great, great. Thank you, Dr. Waleed, for those soulful end words at the end. And I'd just like to thank everyone who's been listening to this podcast on loneliness and solitude. And we hope to that you'll tune in for the next show as well. So all the best from us, and peace be upon you.